What is going on, everyone? My name is Extreme Serial, and in just a few days we are going to be getting our first rerun banner in Honkai Star Rail. This character is none other than the very first limited character in the game, Seele. At the time of her debut, she was arguably the best damage dealer in the game, a top tier DPS, but it's been a while since then, and we had a lot of new characters added to the ranks. So, what happened to Seele after all this time? Is she still the top tier damage dealer she once was, or has she fallen from grace and unfortunately get caught up in power creep? Well, in this video, I'm going to break it all down and give you an idea of whether or not Seele is still worth pulling for. So let's get to it. First, let's take a look at Seele overall and where she fits on a team. So Seele is a damage dealer of the quantum element. She follows the path of the hunt. Now, looking at the description for the hunt, it reads, deals extraordinary amounts of single target damage, the main damage dealer against elite enemies. Now, the game has been out for a while now, so we can really break down that kind of analysis of the path. And here's the thing about the hunt. While they definitely deal single target damage and no hunt character can hit multiple enemies, at least not currently, when it comes to dealing extraordinary damage, well, that kind of it leaves a lot on the table. Now, fortunately, Seele is the only hunt character that overcomes this, specifically because her whole gimmick and kit centers around defeating opponents to get extra turns, and during that extra turns, she deals more damage. And that's essentially the whole gimmick behind what she has to offer. She's a hunt character that frees herself from the chains of the shortcomings that a hunt character normally has. She can attack other enemies rather than just one, and when she defeats them, she has no damage loss because she just gets another turn and does more damage during that turn. Now that you have a good general idea of what Seele does, let's break down her kit into more specific attributes. So we're going to start with her talent, which is called Resurgence. And so what Resurgence does is that whenever she defeats an enemy with any of her attacks, she gains an extra turn, and in this buff state, her next attack will deal 80% increased damage. She has it for one turn. At the same time, enemies defeated in this extra turn state, well, it's not going to trigger the extra turn one more time, so you don't get it infinitely. Now, some important things to note here: 80% damage increase. So just to take a snippet of the damage formula, I'm not going to go into super details about the math, but just to point out that damage bonus is a separate value that gets added all together from all your different damage bonus sources, such as this talent, your elemental damage bonus, or even just skill damage bonus. All of those values, they get added together and then multiplied against other important attributes such as crit damage and base damage. Now, usually you cannot build damage bonus through your relics. You only get it through your planar sphere, which is an elemental bonus of 38.8 at most. And then the rest comes from either traces, or it comes from your light cone, or even support characters. Seele, however, gets an 80% buff from this Resurgence, which is massive, so nothing to kind of slouch at. Next, let's take a look at Seele's skill, the Sheathed Blade. So this is a single target attack that increases Seele's speed by 25% for 2 turns, and at max trace deals quantum damage equal to 220% of Seele's attack, once again to a single target. So the important thing here is that 25% for 2 turns on her speed. Now, Seele is a character that always wants to be using her skill when she can. However, if you find that you need to use your basic attack for 1 turn because you ran out of points, well, that's okay. You'll still have the buff available, which is pretty nice. It's pretty lenient on having constant uptime, and that uptime is great because her base speed is 115. She's an incredibly fast character, and with a 25% buff, she comes out to a 143 to 144 speed, depending on how the game is going to round that. Either way, that is enough speed to hit some very basic speed thresholds, and it brings you very close to either 151 speed to play with Asta at less than E5, so you can get 201 for those sweet double turns, or 148 speed if you have E5 Asta. Either way, it's a really great place to be, and it makes building the character a whole lot easier. Taking a look at Seele's basic attack, which is called Thwack, it's a single target attack that deals quantum damage equal to 100% of Seele's attack to a single enemy. Pretty straightforward. It's basically every damage dealing character's basic attack. However, the important thing to know is the bonus trace. So what this does is after using a basic attack, Seele's next action will be advance forward, by 20%. Now, normally you always want to be using Seele's skill because it's going to do the most damage. The multiplier is over double the basic attack and you get that speed buff. But like I was saying previously, I mean, on the chance that maybe you just run out of skill points for whatever reason and you have to use the basic attack, 1, your buff will still last because it lasts 2 turns, and 2, you do get some benefit. Your next action is advanced forward by 20%. And then for the final damage dealing attribute Seele can do, it's her ultimate Butterfly Fury. Now, Seele enters her buffed state of Resurgence when she uses her ultimate, which is great, and she deals quantum damage equal to 425% of her attack to a single enemy. A very straightforward ultimate and very powerful. This is fantastic for either getting that big chunk of damage to reactivate Resurgence again, and it has the added bonus of just having Resurgence tacked onto it. So even if you haven't defeated an extra enemy, you don't need to wait to use her ultimate, it'll just give you that damage buff. Now, an important thing to know about Seele is that most of her attacks do not deal multiple hits of damage, specifically her ultimate. It is just one chunk of damage all at once, which is really nice to see a really big number happen at one time. But the downside is that any effects that come from having multiple hits are not going to be that great on Seele. Think about light cones and other damage abilities that rely on hitting multiple times, maybe even a buff in the simulated universe. They don't really work so well on Seele, so it's important to know that. The only exception would be her skill. It does hit a few times, but it's really not enough to get the most out of those effects, but just know that happens to be the exception. Before we move on to Seele's technique, I want to bring to your attention Seele's traces. Now, we went over one of them previously, where your action is advanced by 20% when using your basic attack, but there's 2 others and they are quite powerful. The first is called Lacerate. This happens at Character Ascension 4, and while Seele is in her buff state, her quantum resistance penetration increases by 20%. This is really powerful because most likely you'll be combining her with a 4-piece quantum set, which increases your defense penetration by 10 to 20%. Now, the reason this is really valuable is because resistance and defense are values multiplied against each other to kind of prevent you from doing damage. So the fact that you have your eggs in both baskets there, you have resistance penetration and defense penetration, adds up to a whole lot of extra damage for Seele. Seele's last trace is called Nightshade, available at Character Ascension 2. When her current HP percentage is 50% or lower, it reduces the chance of being attacked by enemies. This is just a solid quality of life trace to have. Finally, let's go over Seele's technique, Phantom Illusion. So after using her technique, she gains stealth for 20 seconds. While stealth is active, no enemies can detect Seele and she can just run right by them. It's pretty nice for just avoiding any enemy encounters and even sneaking up on a target. Now, there is an added bonus that when you attack an enemy out of stealth, you will immediately enter your buffed state. Now, this is really great because when you get that 80% damage bonus right away, you can potentially pick off a weak target or one of those small adds and get an extra turn right at the start of battle. Looking at Seele's kit specifically, you can really see that what she offers is very straightforward. It's a lot of single target damage, and that's just without any supports. On top of that, she overcomes those downfalls of hunt characters where they can't really affect any enemies next to the main target, and so a lot of times you might have to sacrifice DPS to target that add next to your elite. But Seele doesn't suffer that loss, as she can take down that add and get an extra turn with her Resurgence and then attack the elite or boss enemy for an even greater amount of damage. But I mentioned earlier that while Seele was arguably the best DPS in the game upon her release, it's been some time since then. We've had more hyper carry DPS come about, and so where does Seele fall now? Is she still just as great as she was, or really has she just kind of plummeted and disappeared among a sea of butterflies? Well, let's take a look at the other characters that came about since Seele, such as the character Blade, Imbibitor Lune, and Jing Liu. So Blade was a strong damage dealer, and I'd say that his kit is very unique compared to Seele's. What he really has going for him is the fact that he can attack multiple enemies because he's a destruction character. However, characters such as Imbibitor Lunay and Jing Liu are definitely power creeps to Seele. Imbibitor Lunay has the downside of taking more skill points, and he's a little tough to kind of get off the ground, but once he gets going, he can do an absurd amount of damage to multiple targets. Jing Liu, on the other hand, is very similar. She's right there alongside Imbibitor Lunay, if not a little higher. Jing Liu has a lot baked into her kit from the start. Where Seele has a ton of damage bonus and that extra turn, Jing Liu has all the attack you could ever want, and on top of that comes with a huge 50% boost to her crit rate and a good chunk of crit damage caked in. Really, the only thing she's missing is that damage bonus and some resistance penetration. However, looking at Seele and comparing her to these other damage dealers, there's two things Seele does have going for her, and that happens to be that big old damage bonus she gets from her resurgence state, and also that 20% resistance penetration, once again paired with some defense penetration, and that's a very powerful combo. But the downside happens to be her turn cycling mechanic. It seems really unique and it's pretty cool. However, it doesn't make her stand out amongst these other destruction units. It's just a way for her to compensate, specifically because destruction characters can do a lot of damage to one target and then a decent amount of damage to these targets next to them. They can take down 3 targets fairly easily. They don't have to worry about changing who they attack and losing out on DPS, especially when the kind of normal flow of battle is you have your big elite or boss enemy and these smaller adds surrounding them. Now, hunt characters can't do this. They can only target either the big boss or they can target the adds, and so they lose out on a lot of damage they could be doing to the one that, well, they haven't targeted. Now, Seele's turn mechanic, it just compensates for this. Once again, it frees her from the chains of being a hunt character, but that doesn't really stand out all that much compared to these other damage dealers. Now, just because she doesn't stand out compared to other damage dealers such as Imbibitor Lunay and Jing Liu and even Blade, does that matter for the sake of the game? Will that really affect your gameplay? The answer currently is no. Seele is a perfectly viable character in Honkai Star Rail and a powerful damage dealer that can get you through all the content in the game. Now, characters such as Imbibitor Lunay and Jing Liu might have an easier time doing this as they have more baked into their kit, but that doesn't mean Seele is somehow left out. She has in fact fallen off a bit from her heydays where she was the best damage dealer in the game, but the difficulty of the game itself hasn't risen to the point where it's just a barrier that she can't overcome. She can in fact clear through all the content in the game and do so quite easily if you decide to invest in the character. Let's talk about team setups for Seele next. How exactly does she play into a team and what is her major role? We know she's a damage dealer, but how does she deal damage and who does she want next to her? So most teams are going to have Seele as a hyper carry. By hyper carry, I mean that Seele is the primary damage dealer and every other character on the team is there to either support her or keep the team alive. Seele usually likes any of the supports in Honkai Star Rail, but specifically the one that stands out is the limited 5-star character, Silverwolf. Silverwolf has the ability to implant a quantum weakness on the target. What this lets Seele do is make the most out of that 4-piece quantum set, where you're now going to be getting 20% defense penetration combined with her 20% resistance penetration and the defense down that Silverwolf provides. It's a whole lot of extra damage and a almost guaranteed quantum weakness on a target, so a really good thing to have. Now, if you don't have Silverwolf, any of the other support characters currently in the game work out for Seele. Whether it is Astra providing attack or a great speed buff, Ayla providing a nice defense down to the entire enemy team, or Tingyun restoring Seele's energy and also providing an attack buff and generating skill points. And lastly, we have Bronya, who's easily one of the best supports in the game overall, and she can advance Seele's turn, allowing her to take more turns than she normally would, buffing her damage bonus and her crit damage along with attack Bronya really just does it all. Now lastly, you're going to have a support or sustain unit. This can be whichever you want. It can be a character from the Path of Abundance for more longer term content, or you can go with a powerful preservation unit or shielder on something shorter like MOC, where you don't need to be healing over time, you just need to withstand a certain amount of damage and destroy your opponent. Let's talk about Seele as a sub DPS next. This is a team that normally doesn't get used with her, but does have potential in the future. Essentially, the issue with this team is that Seele always wants to use her skill, so she eats away at SP. Now, the kind of way to make up for this would be to either have another damage dealer on the team that doesn't need to eat SP as much as Seele, or some kind of support character that gives back SP. In this situation, you could easily take out a support and essentially have 2 damage dealers, one being Seele, and then followed by a support and a sustain unit. Currently, I don't find this team very viable, but do look out for it in the future. I have a strong feeling that something like this can definitely work. Now here's the wrap, everyone. Seele is a very powerful single target damage dealer with a very unique extra turn mechanic baked into her kit. She defeats enemies and gets extra turns and does even more damage with them. Now at first she was the most powerful DPS in the game, but she has in fact fallen from grace. This does not mean that she cannot clear all the content in the game, but rather other characters will have an easier time doing it. So if you're looking for a powerful damage dealer that functions as a hyper carry, and you really like Seele's design and what she has going for her, then I would suggest giving her a consideration. On the other hand, if you're looking for characters with a higher damage ceiling, or just an easier time clearing content, then I would suggest pulling for the character Jing Liu that's currently available, or saving for a rerun like Imbibed or Lune, or potentially a future and upcoming character. Lastly, to answer the question of whether or not I will be pulling for Seele on her rerun, the answer is I already have Seele. I happen to be a day 1 player, and I pulled for Seele upon her initial release. I thought she was a really cool character at the time and has some of the most profound and thought-provoking voice lines in the entire game. Now for her rerun, because I like her a lot, I'm actually planning on pulling her light cone if I get lucky enough. I think it's going to bring out the most of her character, and I'm excited to try it out. And that's the video, everyone. Hopefully I've given you some insight into whether or not Seele is worth it for you on her rerun. Make sure to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you guys on the next one.